Hello, Rotarians and friends of Rotary District 5340. This is Janice Kurth, past district governor, and I am your Global Grants Chair for the year 2020-2021. This Zoom recording is to serve as your Global Grants Management Seminar, which is required for club qualification to do global grants for the next Rotary year. I'm sorry that I will miss seeing each of you in person at our district grants training seminar. But as you know, we are all stuck at home, and so we are providing this training online for you. 2 people from your club will be required to watch this seminar, and then there is a quiz, which you will be referred to at the end, which you will take and complete. And the results of that quiz will be emailed to our stewardship chair, Marianne Erickson, who will keep track of all the club's qualifications to do global grants. So with that, I will go ahead and proceed. The first thing I want to tell you is that virtually everything I will tell you in this seminar and much, much, much more is available in this publication put out by the Rotary Foundation. This is called A Guide to Global Grants. And I will show you where you can obtain your own personal copy of this that has many, many more details about how to do global grants than I will discuss today. This is available online through My Rotary. Now, each and every one of you should be registered for My Rotary. This is at the Rotary International website, which is rotary.org. If you're not registered, you can go to myrotary.org and then register. Most of us are registered, and it will be necessary to be registered if you are to apply for a global grant. So once you log on to My Rotary, you will click the Take Action, and then under Apply for Grants, click Grant Center. This will be most important for all of your global grant activities. When you click Grant Center, it will bring you to this landing page. Now, at this point in the seminar, I mostly want to point out this section right here on the right that says Grant Resources. On the live website, each and every one of these items in blue, and it does continue further down if you scroll down, are helpful resources and tools to help you with your global grants. In this list, you will find that Guide to Global Grant that I showed you a couple of slides ago. You'll also have things like a global grant calculator. You'll have a very important memorandum of understanding that is required if you're using other organizations to work with in a grant, and many, many more things. So I encourage each and every one of you, once you start on a global grant process, to go to this landing page and just scroll through this extensive list of resources that are available to help you. One of the other things that is available here is the Global Grant Application Template. When you apply for your global grant to the Rotary Foundation, it is completely 100% online with drop-down menus and all of those things. But as you're planning to write your grant, if you'd like to have a more written format where you can see exactly which questions you're going to be asked when you actually get online to do it, use this Global Grant Application Template. There's many, many more resources here. Please do go to this site. At a minimum, download the Guide to Global Grants, because that will literally be your most important resource as you go through this process. So before you can even do anything with global grants, there are specific club qualifications that your club must meet in order to do a global grant. And I will go over those now. First, you must be up to date on all district and Rotary International dues. As you know, District Governor-elect Steve Weitzen is going to help us out a little bit with district dues next year, so that should be useful. But those dues need to be up to date, and they are due twice a year. Secondly, you must have 2 club members having completed this training, which you are now listening to, and it needs to be documented. They need to have taken the quiz, and Marianne Erickson needs to have received that confirmation that the quiz was completed and passed at a 70% level. Number 3, there is a memorandum of understanding that your club must sign. That is a memorandum of understanding with the Rotary Foundation. That form needs to be signed by next year's club president, that's the 2020-2021 president, and the following year's club president. That is the president that your club will have for 2021-2022. Now, for a few clubs, that president for 2021-2022 may not be known right now, this minute, or even perhaps if you put a global grant application in early in the next Rotary year. So you will have to make a best judgment as to who you think that might be, or perhaps put the current vice president signature in that document. But most of the clubs will have that president already assigned. And then that MOU must be uploaded in the documents section so that, again, our stewardship chair can see that you have signed the memorandum of understanding. And I'll talk about exactly where that is a little bit later. So how do you get this memorandum of understanding? Well, it is on our district website. And I encourage you, if you don't think you can remember where to find this, to pause this recording and take a picture of this screen right now so that you have the instructions of how to download the MOU. You will go to our district website, which is rotary5340.org. Up on the top then, you will click Foundation, and then there will be a drop-down menu, and you will click Grants. Once you do that, you will then scroll down to where it says Downloads, and the first item under Downloads is the Club Memorandum of Understanding on the left. Click on the Club Memorandum of Understanding and it will open. And at that point, you are able to print it or you can download the Memorandum of Understanding. Remember, each club must have a signed memorandum of understanding with the Rotary Foundation before they can receive a global grant. The fourth part of club qualification is that all grant reporting must be up to date. All global grants have annual reports due and then reports at the end. We'll go over this once again as well. But you can't be, your club cannot be late on any of your reports if you are to get another grant approved. There's also one other little point that I wanted to make right here, and that is that no club can have more than 10 active global grants at a time. So we have a few clubs in our district that are very active in global grants that sometimes run into this limitation. So remember, if you have 10 going, you cannot apply for the 11th. Now, number 5, this is a new qualification this year that has been put in place by your district governor, and that is that your club's Rotary Foundation giving goals must be entered by the club president if you are to receive any district designated funds for your global grant. This is something that the club president will need to do, and starting July 1st, the club president will have access to their goal setting for the club in My Rotary. So if you're not one of the club presidents attending this seminar, please encourage your club president, if you want to do a global grant, those foundation goals must be entered. But remember, it's not available until July 1st to that president. And then finally, all grants must comply with the District 5340 Youth Protection Policy if applicable. Sometimes youth aren't involved, and so it's really not a qualification. But you must comply with the Youth Protection Policy if youth are involved in the grant, and there will be any direct communication between members of your club or adults and youth. Okay, so let's go over exactly what a global grant is. First of all, a global grant is a large project. These are not the small projects that each and every one of our clubs do on a regular basis locally in their community. These projects have a minimum budget of $30,000. That's a big project. These projects are also very beneficial to us because these are the funds for doing these projects that are matched by the Rotary Foundation. Now, any global grant must have a minimum World Fund match of $15,000, and we'll talk about how that's calculated next. The maximum World Fund match is $200,000. Let me clarify that to say it is possible to get a larger match than $200,000, but it requires trustee board approval. So it's an extra, very elevated step if you want to do an extremely large project. So how does the Rotary Foundation match our funds? Well, as you are aware, to do a global grant, clubs need to donate cash that they've raised or put together through their contributions and their fundraising. The cash donations that go into a global grant are matched by the TRF at 50%. So if you put in $1,000 for a grant, the Rotary Foundation will match $500. Now, the other thing that started just a few years ago, which many of you are aware of, is that this cash in the past and typically is sent to the Rotary Foundation. The advantage of sending your cash to the Rotary Foundation so that they can then disperse it to the project is you can get Paul Harris points and credit for those donations if you do it that way. In that case, however, there is a 5% surcharge that the Rotary Foundation charges to cover administrative costs. So that adds a little bit to your expense, but it also helps support our staff that work so hard to administer these grants. There is a way to avoid this 5% surcharge, and that is by contributing the club cash contributions directly to the project bank account. Now, I'm jumping a little ahead of myself here, but once a grant is approved, you are required to set up a bank account specifically for that project. At that point, any of the cash contributions can be deposited directly into that bank account rather than sent to TRF. This will avoid that 5% surcharge. You will, however, be required to show TRF that those contributions have been made into the bank account before they will release any of the World Fund match or the district designated funds. Now, the Rotary Foundation matches district designated funds at 100%. So if your club contributes cash, then applies for and is granted an allocation of our district designated funds, or DDF, it will basically, the Rotary Foundation will match the total of those at 1.5. So I know that's a lot of math, but here is a concrete example. Let's say a club or a group of clubs collectively have put together $10,000 worth of cash that they want to contribute for a project. And they have requested DDF match from the district to equal that $10,000. So they have $10,000 of club cash and $10,000 of district designated funds that is going to be put into this project. The match from the Rotary Foundation will then be $15,000. That will be $5,000 as the match portion for the $10,000 in club cash. Remember, it's 50% TRF match for cash, and then $10,000 for matching the DDF, and that is a one-to-one match. So for a $10,000 cash that clubs have put in, the total funds available for the project is $35,000. That's the magic of doing a global grant with the Rotary Foundation. Now, I want to point out one thing. There is a global grant calculator that's available at the Grant Center where I showed you on the right, same place where you get the guide to global grants. And that is very helpful because it's an Excel spreadsheet that has the formulas already put in, and you can just fill in the blank of different things and play with the numbers and figure out exactly what you need in order to do a project of whatever budget your project is. It's a very helpful tool, so I recommend downloading that. So let's talk a little bit about what is required for the grant project itself and then the application. Successful Rotary grants have a number of very important features, which we'll go into more detail with, but these are primarily the main features that make them successful. First of all, it needs to be a project that meets a community need. The community itself needs to express that they have a need rather than us telling communities what they need. The project needs to be sustainable. We want to have our projects move on into the future and be successful and help communities and people long after the grant project is complete. A global grant is by definition a partnership between two clubs in at least two countries. We'll talk about that more. A successful grant must have a plan. That this only makes sense for anyone who has ever tried to accomplish anything. You need a plan in order to make something happen. And then stewardship. This is keeping up with your expenses, following your budget, and making sure that your grant funds are spent as they were intended. So let's go into a little bit more detail on those various aspects. Global grants, as I said, are a partnership. You are required with a global grant to have a host club and an international club. Now, the host is typically a club that is in or very near the community where the project will actually be taking place. These are the on-the-ground Rotarians that will oversee the actual activity as it occurs on the site where the project will happen. The international club is a club from some other country. It can be any other country. Both clubs, remember, must be qualified by both their district and the Rotary International qualification requirements. Now, typically both clubs contribute something financially to a project. Although, interestingly enough, it is not necessary for a host club to contribute to a project. An example of this might be you're doing a project in a very poor rural area, and there's a very small Rotary club there that is able to get in the community, help make things happen, identify the needs, work with local people to get a project done, but they don't have a lot of funds. So they reach out to an international club who will primarily be funding this project, perhaps visiting, at their own expense and a number of other things and helping to oversee the activity, but they may serve as a source of income. Now, there is a rule that the international club must contribute at least 30% of the funding for a project. And the reason for this, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. If you have a host club in, let's say, a very affluent area, and they want to do a global grant, and they say, oh, well, we'll just host all our own project, and you just be the international club. That international club may not see that as a need, so they wouldn't be able to do it if there was that rule. So the international club has to contribute at least 30% of the funding. Now, there are two very important exceptions, one which is of paramount importance for this particular time and next Rotary year. And this is that if it is a COVID-19 related project to give relief because of our current pandemic, that international club 30% funding rule does not apply. There still must be an international club that is helping to oversee and help to monitor the activity of the host club, but they do not have to contribute. Also, if there is a term gift involved that comes from outside the country or an individual has donated those funds for a project, then that 30% funding rule also does not apply. Now, your global grant must also be in one of the 6 areas of focus, and it must have measurable outcomes. And we'll talk about those. So how do you find partners for global grants? And I can tell you from experience, and many other Rotarians in our district will tell you from experience, that one of the hardest things is to find Rotary partners for global grants. You need to have a club that you can have a good partnership with, that is responsible, that will work with you, and that will communicate well, and that is also qualified to do global grants. Very often, one of the problems is, especially in developing countries, people travel there, they see lots of needs, they want to do a project, they're even able to do a lot of fundraising to fund these projects, but they don't have a host club that is willing to work with them on the project. Or there's so many needs there and the host club is small and they can only handle so many projects at one time. This can be one of the most difficult parts of getting a global grant done, is finding a partner to do the global grant with. So how do you overcome that? Well, one of the best ways that many of us have found partners for global grants is at the Rotary Convention. Well, this year, as you know, we don't necessarily have a traditional Rotary Convention, so we're missing out on that opportunity, which is going to make it more difficult for some of us for these projects. You may know that we're going to have a virtual or an online Rotary Convention June 20th to 26th. I know nothing about the format of this and whether or not there will be ways to connect with people virtually. Maybe there will be, maybe there won't, but keep your eye out for that possibility. Another way that we've often found partners is at project fairs. Many developing countries, especially, or areas where there's great need, they will host a project fair once a year or once every other year and invite Rotarians from all over the world to come and visit and see their needs and partner with them for projects. This is a great way. However, I anticipate with all the travel bans right now that we may not be having this opportunity this year, or at least it will be much more limited. So keep your eyes out for those, but it may not be applicable for us this year. Other ways is to use LinkedIn and Facebook and other social media. There's lots of Rotary social media communication that goes on, and that may be a way to reach out if you're looking for a partner for your project. Rotary events are also a great way, even within our district. You know, you go to a district event and you talk with someone and you say, oh, I have this project in country XYZ. Do you know anybody there? And the other Rotarian will say, yes, I met somebody at the convention last year or at this event, or I may know somebody who knows somebody. So communicate and reach out when we're able to have Rotary events, another good way to connect. If you go to matchinggrants.org, this is a website that lists a lot of global grants throughout the world, some of which need funding, and there's contact information for the primary contacts there. If there's an area of the world that you're interested in working but you don't have a specific project, maybe there's a grant that somebody else is already putting together that they're looking for some funding and some partnership. You can participate that way. Finally, not finally, there's many other ways as well, but another great place to find partnerships for grants is at rotary.org, Rotary Ideas. And these are people that basically are putting up ideas about projects they want to do and are looking to help grow it with others. If you have an idea, you can post one there, or if you're looking for a project to do and you don't necessarily have an idea, maybe partnering with somebody who already has something in place at rotary.org is a good idea. So those are all some potential ways. We may be a little more limited this year because of our travel bans and not having all of our normal events. But please reach out and work with your fellow Rotarians, and I'd be happy to help where I can. Whoops. Okay, so once you figure out who your host and your international clubs are going to be, when you go to apply at the Rotary Foundation, you must have a minimum of 3 people that are very involved in this grant. The one is the primary contact, and this is the person who will actually have access to helping to write the grant online, will have to authorize it, which is sort of an electronic signature, if you will. And will be responsible for making sure that the reports get written. So there's 2 primary contacts, one for the host and one for the international clubs. Now, for both of those clubs, in addition, there are 2 additional club members that serve as the grant committee. And it's very important that those additional club members on the committee sort of keep up with what's going on with the global grant. It's not just fill in a name so you have the space filled. Because if anything were to happen to that primary contact, say maybe their job was transferred and they had to move, or they became unwell and couldn't carry on, those additional club members will need to make sure on behalf of your club that this project gets completed and obeys by the rule and the reporting gets done and all of those things. So the additional club members are important. Now, a relatively new grant requirement, which started just a couple of years ago, is the requirement to do a community assessment before the Rotary Foundation will approve any grant. The community assessment form is available at the Grant Center. On that right-hand side, right where the guide is, the calculator is, the community assessment form is there as well. The purpose of this community assessment is to make sure that the project you're proposing really meets something that people in that community believe they need. So we want projects that are based on real needs. This community assessment tool, which is available, will also identify resources that your club and any other potential partners have to help you put together the project most effectively. It requires talking and working with the community. And the community assessment tool guide, which you see a picture here on your screen, is available at that grant center, and it'll walk you through how you do this community assessment. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the methods that are used for the assessment. When you're looking at a community and say you have an idea about something you may want to do, it's really important to find out what the community thinks about this idea and if they need it. So in that guide to community assessment, they talk about a number of methods you can use for assessing the community. And I've listed some of the most important ones, I believe, here. And I'll talk about them briefly. One is a survey. Everyone knows what a survey is. Survey a community to see what they believe about their needs for water, or food, or economic development, whatever the case may be. You can do an assessment by having a community meeting with an agenda, a local community leader, and take notes and ask opinions and get a sense from the community about what they need. Another method of assessment is simply interviewing, maybe interviewing community leaders, people in the community that will be affected or affected by whatever the intervention or project you're interested in. You can also put together focus groups, maybe groups of people who may be a little more knowledgeable about whatever the topic of your grant is, so that they can more carefully investigate. Another method is an asset inventory. This may be increasingly important this year, for example, if you're going to do a COVID-related global grant. I know of one that has already been done where you simply do an inventory of the assets. If you're providing, say, personal protection equipment, do an inventory of how many items of each of several different categories of personal protective equipment you need, and assets of how many healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, other people involved, and then how that matches up, and then you can build an argument that these there are things missing, and this is exactly what we need. Another method they talk about is something called community mapping, which when I first read this, I wasn't real sure what it was, so I did a little investigating and educated myself. Community mapping is a situation where you actually sort of build a map of the community and map on that geographical representation the assets that you have and their location to establish a need for something else. For example, if you have a small community and there's 2 water wells in the community, you can map where the water wells are and then say where the people live. And if you can demonstrate by that map that you have a large number of people that are significantly distant from whatever the 2 water wells are, that's an adequate assessment to show that, yes, building another water well might be useful. So those are just a few examples that you'll find in your assessment tools. Now let's talk about the areas of focus briefly. Most of you are probably familiar with these because they've been with us for a few years now. They are 6, and they include disease, prevention, and treatment. I have a feeling this will be a very large one given our current situation with this pandemic for this next Rotary year. Maternal and child health, water and sanitation, basic education and literacy, economic and community development, and peace and conflict prevention and resolution. Now, if you take away only one bit of advice from this entire grant seminar today, this is probably the most important. When you are writing your global grant, please, please, please only pick one area of focus, no matter how many areas of focus you think your project fits into. And this is very important. I think many of us would like to say, oh, we have this great project because it fits into 4 areas of focus. Isn't that fantastic? And while, yes, it probably is a great project, and you probably could make a good argument that it fits into 4 areas of focus, only pick one. And the reason for that is mainly twofold. First, for each area of focus, you have a review by a person that is expert in that area of focus. So if you pick one area of focus, that's 1 review. If you pick 2, that's 2 reviews. If you pick 3, it's 3 reviews. And I can almost guarantee you that for each area of focus reviewer, there will be additional questions that you will be required to answer. So if you only have one reviewer, that's one set of questions. If you have 3 reviewers, it is 3 sets of questions, and that can add a lot of work to what you need to do to get your grant approved. The second main reason for only one area of focus is that for each area of focus, you will have a separate set of measurable outcomes that you will be required to track. So if you're doing it for one area of focus, again, it's a few different measures which are pretty manageable. If you have 3 different areas of focus and you have 3 sets of measures, it can get very complicated and very difficult. So again, one area of focus for each grant. Okay, we talked about how grants need to be sustainable. And the purpose of this is that what we really want to do is give a community the skills and knowledge to maintain project outcomes for the long term after our grant funds have been expended. So how do we do that? This slide shows you how Rotary International defines sustainability. So first, they have you start with the community. Again, we spent a long time talking about the community assessment, and that is, if it's going to continue, the community needs to value whatever the project is and see it as something that's important. So that's step 1 in sustainability. Secondly is encourage local ownership. You want to find community members who can help you in this project and have a vested interest in seeing that it continues. We want the local people to help to own this project so that after the Rotarians leave, they continue to benefit from this work. Third, provide training. This is probably the single most important thing you can do with a global grant to make it sustainable. And that is train the people. Sometimes the entire grant is about training, right? The purpose is you go in and you train the trainers who then train other people, and it continues on and on and on because you're providing a new skill and a new ability to a community. But no matter what your project is, there should be a training component for the local community. Also, part of sustainability is buying local. Buy your supplies as much as you can from local sources. Obviously, Economics 101, if you bring in grant money and you spend that grant money buying supplies in that community, you're helping that community in yet another way by building it economically as you're accomplishing the goals of your project. Now, there may be situations where you're unable to do that. An example may be providing computers in schools, for example. Very often those have to be brought in from outside sources, but there is a question on the global grant application about buying local, and if you are not buying local, you have to explain why. So always keep that in mind. And then as you're doing your project, work hard at finding local funding to help sustain that project. Sometimes grants are put in place to show an example with the idea of then government taking up the funding afterwards. And that has happened multiple times in multiple different scenarios. So as you are doing your work, try to get local funding to help to continue and sustain that project. And then finally, measure your success. If a project's going to be sustainable, you should be able to show that there was some kind of successful outcome or result. And we'll talk about measuring success more in a moment. So you will be required to set up a monitoring and evaluation plan for your project in the grant application. And don't be intimidated by this, because the application actually walks you through each of these steps, and it helps you build it as you're doing the process. So first, it's really important to have a clear and objective project goal before you even start the whole process. So once you have your goals in mind, and you will have to state what the goals of the project are, you then identify so-called Rotary Foundation standard measures. Now, again, don't be afraid. In the section under monitoring and evaluation, there's a drop down that says Rotary Foundation standard measures, and you pick a few of those that will apply to your particular project. And as you can imagine, no standard measure applies to every project, and no project can necessarily use every standard measure. So you pick those standard measures that are applicable, and we'll talk, I'll give you some examples of those on the next slide. In addition, you can identify additional project-specific measures, and these are ones where you rather than picking from a drop-down list, you actually type in what your measure is, because maybe it's different from any of those standard measures. So your typical monitoring and evaluation plan is a combination of Rotary Foundation standard measures and project-specific measures. You will then establish baseline data and the methods you'll use to collect those data. So your baseline data is typically going to be, if you have all these measures that you've outlined, you want to know where you're starting from. So if you're starting from zero, say we started out with 0 bits of, say, personal protective equipment in this hospital, and at the end, how many were in active use, for example. You'll also submit a plan as part of the online application, and it walks you right through this process. It's really not difficult. But it's important to collect data during the project so that you can monitor your progress. And then finally, you evaluate the data and submit your results in your online report. So what are some examples of Rotary Foundation standard measures? And probably if you were going to sit at home and try to come up with them, you would come up with a list very similar to this. But these are some of the examples under various areas of focus that they have. The number of direct beneficiaries. How many people benefited directly from this project? If it's a water well, how many people had access to fresh water that didn't before? And then there's things like the number of indirect beneficiaries. An example of this might be if your project is to train 10 people how to be trainers or educate other people. The indirect beneficiaries may be an estimate of the number of people you anticipate those 10 people training. So even though your project may be trained 10 people, maybe it's 1,000 people that will eventually be educated. So those would be your indirect beneficiaries. Another measure is the number of people trained. Very simple. The number of participants. Say part of your project is to do a health fair. How many people participated in the health fair? The number of people receiving a service. If your project is to provide mammograms in rural communities, how many people will receive those mammograms? The number of events to be held. Very often global grants include outreach or fairs. I mentioned health fairs, that's an example. How many of those types of events? In economic and community development, often one of the things we want to know is how many jobs were created. You may measure the number of benefiting facilities. If you're going to provide COVID-19 tests to hospitals, how many hospitals benefited? And in peace and conflict resolution, one of the things you may measure is the number of communities with less conflict. So those are just some of the examples, although there are many, many, many more. At this point, I want to take a break and point out that almost everything I've been talking about in this training seminar so far has related to so-called humanitarian grants, which are the vast majority of global grants that we do in our district and happen really in the whole Rotary world. And those are sort of your typical projects where you go in and you create or you do something in a community to benefit the community. But I want to point out that there are a couple of other types of global grants. And when you go into the global grant application, it'll ask you to choose a humanitarian project, which, as I said, is most of what most of you are going to be doing. Or another option is a global grant scholarship. And the application for a global grant scholarship is a bit different. Now, the Rotary Foundation provides scholarships for graduate study only. They don't provide scholarships for undergraduate or bachelor's degrees, normal college degrees. All of our scholarships are for graduate work, and the application will be a bit different. If you are doing a grant for a global grant scholarship, you'll still have to pick an area of focus. You'll still, there are many things that are the same, but some of the outcome measures and all that are different. And I haven't talked specifically to those. If you need assistance with a grant like this, please contact me. Another type of grant that is a bit different, it's the third type of grant that's on that application, and that's a global grant vocational training team. The purpose of these grants is to either provide training or be trained where skills are not available within the community. It's a very specific kind of grant, and we haven't had one of these in our district in a number of years, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. If you need assistance, again, please contact me with this type of grant. So now I will talk a little bit about the Rotary District 5340 specific global grant rules. These are things that apply really only to our district, and they're only specific for this Rotary year because, or the upcoming 2020-2021 Rotary year. Each year this is reassessed, and the Rotary Foundation Committee comes up with exactly what the rules will be. So these are your district specific rules with regard to primarily district designated funds for next Rotary year. As has been the case for several years running now, each club will be eligible for up to $10,000 in DDF for the upcoming Rotary year. And that is to be a match for club cash contributions at a 1-to-1 rate. So if your club would like to receive the full $10,000 in DDF, your club will have to put in $10,000 of cash into one or more global grants as well. Clubs are always encouraged to work together to do bigger grants, so that you may have several clubs coming together at $10,000 a piece, and then you can do a grant that's over $100,000. However, no more than $40,000 in DDF collectively will be allocated for a single grant. So in this case, say maybe you have 4 clubs at $40,000, but if you have 5 clubs each that put in $10,000, instead of $50,000, only $40,000 of DDF will be allocated for that grant. And our application process in our district is that the grant must be fully pledged and entered on matchinggrants.org, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment, before any DDF will be allocated for your project. So in other words, you have to know where all of the money is going to come from for this project before we will say you have X amount of DDF available for this project, and you have to document it and show it at this site. So what is the timeline for global grants? Global grants are considered on an ongoing basis. This is very different from our district grants where we have a hard deadline. You have to apply by August 1st. Global grants are considered on an ongoing basis until all of our DDF funds are allocated. And for the 2021 Rotary year, we have about $112,000 available. Now, do the math. I just told you that each club is eligible for $10,000 in DDF each, and we have over 60 clubs in our districts. That's over 600,000 of possible DDF. There's not enough funds to go around. So I encourage you, if you have a project in mind, please get it in early, because it is a first come, first served basis. As long as the projects meet the requirements of the Rotary Foundation as we see them. So we only have 112,000 available for next Rotary year. So if each one is maximally utilized, that's just over 11 projects at 10,000 apiece, or 11 clubs able to get access to that. So submit your grants early. And as we look at approving the funding, the DDF funding for these grants, they're evaluated with consideration of merit of the project, and also whether a club has given to the Rotary Foundation annual giving. Now, at this point, I want to make one very important point. The District Rotary Foundation Committee cannot approve your grant. The Rotary Foundation in Evanston is the one that approves your grant. We are not the ones to judge whether this is a fundable grant, and they will do all of their review. All we do is say, yes, we will allocate X amount of DDF to this project. And then it's up to the Rotary Foundation to say whether this grant is approvable or not. So when we consider grants in our district committee meetings, very often we look at the grant and we think, oh, this is a great project. But sitting around the table in that committee, we have a fair amount of experience with grants. And so very often we can understand that there may be some issues, and we may give some feedback to the club that has submitted, saying, you know, we think you need to change this, or we're not sure this is going to be fundable, or whatever the case may be, and make suggestions before you actually make the application to the Rotary Foundation in order to help increase the chances, in our opinion, that this grant would be approved. But we cannot approve a grant. That has to come from Evanston. All we actually approve is the allocation of our district DDF to your grant. I hope that's clear. So how do you actually go about the process of applying? Well, in our district, I mentioned that you must enter your grant at matchinggrants.org in order to get your DDF allocation. This is how we keep up with all of our district data. So you go to the website, matchinggrants.org, and then you click on Global Grants, here where you see the red arrow. And then you come to a screen like this, and up here at the top, you click on Submit a Project. It's really very straightforward. And then you have a screen like this that walks you through, fill in the blanks. It's really very simple. A project title, where is it going to take place? Make sure you select the correct Rotary year from the drop down. You have to pick an area of focus. And then you give a project description. Now this project description here does not need to be terribly extensive, because this is not your grant application. Try to cover the specifics, what it is you're going to do, who is going to benefit, where it's going to be, how you might measure your outcomes, something about your timeline. This is for the Rotary Foundation Committee, for them to get an idea about what it is you intend to do. Then the primary host partner, this part must be filled in order for this to be saved. You have to have a host club identified. So if you have an idea about doing something abroad and you haven't identified your host partner, you can't even enter it onto this site yet. You have to identify that host partner. Now the international partner, very often in our area, it's our District 5340 clubs that are participating, but not always. Sometimes the project is done here and the international partner might be somewhere else. This part doesn't have to be filled in right away. This can wait until later. And then as you go to the bottom of your screen here, this is where you will fill in the total budget for your grant. This is very important because when you get to the financing page, which I will then use, it'll use this number to tell you if your project is fully pledged. Another thing I want to point out that's important to fill in, you don't have to have some of these other things down here. You can click save and it'll save without those. And initially when you put it in, you don't necessarily have to have your Rotary Foundation grant number. However, when you start to do your application and you have a grant number, and I'll show you that how that happens, you'll need to come back to this site and populate this field right here. So this is where you start with your global grant. You save this and it goes up on the matchinggrants.org website. So here's an example of one that has been, it has been entered properly, and at the bottom it says we need $100,000. So you can click here on pledge support for this project, and you get to a screen like this where your club, any other district can pledge their support for this project and add those pledges in. This is an example where I've put in my own information, and our club's going to contribute $1,000, and then maybe I would put $1,000 of DDF here. I want to request $1,000 of our allocation of DDF to match that, and then click save. It's also possible if all your DDF is expended and you still want to contribute, you can just leave that blank and not do any DDF. That's perfectly acceptable as well. What is not acceptable is entering in 0 or some number less than 100% of the DDF in this field. So you couldn't enter 500 cash and 1,000 of DDF, because you will only get $500 of DDF, because we match the DDF only up to the amount that the club has put in. So here's an example of a grant where you see lots of clubs have entered in their cash pledges, some matched with DDF, some not. The other thing I will point out is every district is different. So some districts may agree to put in DDF alone that is not necessarily matched by clubs. Those districts, that's fine if that's how they operate. Our district is not. If you put District 5340 DDF and some number out here, it will not be approved. You need to enter it like this, where you have La Jolla Sunrise 5340, 10,000 cash, 10,000 of DDF requested. So that's how the information should be entered. When this number here, additional club needed, goes to 0, it will show up as fully pledged, and then our committee will consider any of the 5340 DDF requested. You click on this Documents tab, and that is where you have the ability to upload that MOU we talked about earlier. For your club to do a global grant, you will need to have a signed MOU uploaded in the Documents section, or the DDF will not be approved. Okay, so once you get your grant fully pledged and the committee meets and approves your DDF, now it is time to apply for your global grant on the Rotary Foundation website. So again, here we are at that grant center where I showed you at the beginning. On the right-hand side, all those resources that I showed you at the beginning, where you can get all kinds of information to help you with your grant application. And you're ready to go, so you click here where it says apply for a grant. And then it gives you this is the global grant application basic information. This is the first thing that comes up, and this is the minimum amount of information that you must put in order to save this grant on the Rotary Foundation website. And you do not have to have everything in place before you save it. It saves as a draft until you click submit. So you can work on this over several days, several weeks, whatever the case may be. Just make sure you save after each work period. So you need to have a name for your project, and then here's those 3 fields I told you. The vast majority of your projects will be humanitarian, so you just click humanitarian project, and then you will need to put in the primary host and international contacts for the project. And at that point, you can click this save and continue or this exit button, and it will save this grant. If you click save and continue, at that point, you will have a number that pops up here as the grant number. And it will say here under grant status, draft. So you now have your TRF grant number, and that will be the number that follows this grant from this moment through, as long as it's approved and everything goes well, through the completion and closing of this grant. It will not change. After you fill in this basic information, you'll see a number of bars down below here, which show you all the different sections that you will need to fill in. You click each one of these individually and just follow the steps, fill in the blanks. It really is pretty simple. They ask you the questions in such a way that they are very simple to answer, and everything needs to be completed. What I will say is this is not like writing a huge NIH scientific application or anything like that. In each of the fields, answer the question that they ask, but don't go on and wax poetic and think you have to, tell tons of background information and all kinds of things like we learned about writing reports and term papers in high school. Just answer the question and tell them exactly what they want to know and nothing extra. Keep it short and sweet and simple. So, assuming that you have then gone through each of those steps, you have submitted your grant. Likely, the Rotary Foundation, after review, will come back with some questions. You can answer those questions in an email, usually, unless the grant is so far off, they say, we're reverting this grant back to draft status. Then you have to go in and change the grant itself. But most often what happens is they come back and they just want a little additional information. Sometimes it seems like it's a lot of additional information. But you will have some questions and you can answer those. You send them back, you satisfy them, and then they send you word that your grant is approved. And in that approval email, you will have very specific instructions as to what you need to do next. The most important thing is people need to pay their money to the Rotary Foundation or to this project, and you will need to establish a project-specific bank account. Now, this is very important. For each project, there needs to be a separate bank account. The bank account can be in the host country, or sometimes it's at the international sponsoring club's country, and they allocate the funds out. It's very, it is very project specific because it depends on the particular situation of where the project is going to be taking place. In some situations, it just makes sense for the international club to hold on to the vast majority of the funding and then allocate it out as appropriate. So you set up this project-specific bank account. This is a bank account. None of your club dues, none of your club lunches, none of your other club projects, nothing else is putting money in or taking money out of this account that doesn't have to do exactly with this global grant project. I can't stress that enough. You will have to show copies of your bank statements from this account for your reporting, which will show all funds going in and out, and you have to account for every transaction pretty much. So that'll be the first thing you have to do. And then all your cash has to be sent to the Rotary Foundation or to the bank account. If you send it to the Rotary Foundation and get Paul Harris credit, you'll have to pay a 5% surcharge, but there's no surcharge if you send it directly to the project bank account. And then the Rotary Foundation will wire their matching funds as well as the DDF to that bank account so that the project can be completed. Now that the grant's been approved and the funds are all in place, you start your project. It's very important that you manage the project responsibly. What does that mean? Well, you must have proper financial controls over what's going on. You need to know where every single dollar is going because remember, these are philanthropic dollars that all of us have helped to made donations, we've helped to raise funds, and we need to be responsible stewards of these funds. It's important that your project adhere to any technical standards that may apply. This may be important in things like water projects. You need to make sure that the grant is meeting the needs of the beneficiaries, that you are fulfilling the objectives of the grant, and that the funds are safeguarded, as I said. And remember, grant management is a responsibility of both the international and the host club. As part of grant management, it's important that you document all expenditures on the project. Save all your receipts and invoices and keep a log of all those expenses. This can be done in an Excel spreadsheet, some other database, or in some countries they don't have access to all that, so it happens on paper in a notebook. All of that is acceptable, but keep track of all of that. As I said, bank statements will be required, so be aware of that. Most bank statements, at least in our country, are of course saved online, so that's easy, but that may not be the case in other countries, so make sure you have access to those bank statements. And then, as I said, reports are due annually and upon project completion. And to do your reporting, it's also an online process. You just go to the grant page, and on the right-hand side, you click report, and it walks you through exactly what it is you need to do to complete your report. It's important that when you're doing your project that you spend grant funds only on items in the grant application. If it wasn't in the application, you're not really authorized to spend Rotary Foundation funds on that item. If for some reason in the course of your project, and if this does happen, of course, if your spending plan is to change significantly, contact the Rotary Foundation in advance for approval of that change in the spending plan. And almost always they will work with you and approve it. If you are under budget, you don't spend all the money on the exact project that you set out to do, you can contact the Rotary Foundation in advance for permission to spend the remaining funds in some other manner. Maybe it's to add simply more of what you've already spent money on. Sometimes they'll approve something that is even a little bit different, that in the course of the project you identified there might be another need, and if you have $5,000 extra left or $1,000 extra, you could really accomplish it. It would make a difference. If you just ask them for permission, again, almost always I've seen them approve this, but you must do it in advance. And know that any unspent funds at the end of the grant will need to be returned to the Rotary Foundation before they will close this grant. And they're very serious about this, and they've held clubs liable for those monies if they're not returned and they're not spent or documented as appropriately spent on your project. So that's why the financial management is key. Finally, I'll end with giving you some places where there is some additional resources that you can find. The first is at Rotary.org, My Rotary. I've told you multiple times in this seminar about this resource here on the right-hand side. Each of these blue items is a clickable link to find resources. There's also resources at Rotary 5340 under Foundation Resources and References, and there's also a Global Grant Calculator here. And oops, I just realized our zone numbers have changed. It's now Rotary 2627, not 2526. And there is, under the Rotary Foundation on the top right, there's a resource guide there, which gives you all kinds of resources. Again, I apologize, that's the wrong URL. It's now Rotary 2627, not 2526. And then this important announcement, we are starting now to consider DDF allocations for global grants for the 2020-2021 Rotary year. So if you have, as soon as you're able and have a global grant fully pledged and you're ready to go, we are prepared to begin considering those DDF allocations, which will actually be our DDF that is available to us as of July 1. So you're welcome to go ahead and get those grants in. Our committee will review them, and hopefully we can get you all off and doing good in the world. And with that, I will say thank you very much from the Rotary Foundation for all the work you do. And I personally thank you too for all the difference you're making for people in our world. And I am happy to have you contact me. My email is shown here on the screen. I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any clarifications. This may not have been as nice as sitting all together and sharing our ideas in person, but I really appreciate all that you do, and I'm happy to help out however I can. So thank you very much. I hope you are all staying well and safe, and I wish you a great Rotary year. Now, please take the quiz at the completion of this so that you can get credit for having attended this seminar. Thank you.